Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and the video you're about to check out here is a selection from one of my online skin-on-frame boat building classes. So if you like what you see here, make sure you head over to capefalconkayaks.com, where I've got a bunch more skin-on-frame resources, plan sets, video classes, and a bunch of stuff you can check out for free as well. These super detailed video classes contain all the knowledge that I've gained over 20 years of being a full-time professional skin-on-frame boat builder, so you can skip the learning curve, avoid the common building mistakes, and end up with a skin-on-frame boat that's perfectly fitted to your body and your paddling lifestyle on your first try. All right, enjoy the video. So in the last video here, I showed you how to use 2 layers from a foam camping mat to make a really simple, inexpensive, and easy to build seat for the bottom of any of my kayaks. But I also mentioned in that video that for about 10% of people that are either really bony or really heavy, they can sink down far enough into that pad that they're still touching the ribs and the keel, and obviously that's uncomfortable. So if you end up being one of those people, or you just want to do something different than what I showed you earlier to put a seat in the bottom of your kayak, I would recommend building a really simple suspended cloth seat. Now, this is going to be easier for me to actually just show you when we do it inside the kayak here, but just to give you an idea of what we're going to do, I've got a little bit of fabric that was left over from the kayak skinning process. I've doubled it over and I've sewed it to a specific width and a specific length. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to fix it to the inside of the kayak in a way to where it's still going to be removable, but it'll sit nice and firm and will allow your butt to sink as low as it can so you can still be nice and stable, but not any lower than that to where you're going to end up touching the ribs and the keel. So what you're looking at here is a scrap of cloth that's left over from the kayak skinning process that's doubled over and then sewn down one edge. And the way that you get the measurement for how wide this needs to be is you want to measure the distance between this rib and this rib right here. So in this kayak, that happens to be 8 inches. And then I'm going to double that number to 16 inches. And then I'm going to add 2 more inches on top of that, just so I can fold over this seam right here so it doesn't have a ragged edge. So just to reiterate here, what you're looking at is 2 layers of the nylon cloth that I used to skin the kayak. But just like I said, this doesn't have to be this particular cloth. And also, if it ends up being much heavier cloth than this, you might be able to get away with just doing 1 layer. Or if you're using a thinner cloth, you might have to do a whole bunch of layers. So what really matters here is that when you're done sewing this up on either side, it ends up being the same width as the distance between those 2 ribs that we measured. Now, for the length of this, it isn't super critical. I typically go with about 30 inches here because that's more than long enough for any boat that I need to put one of these in. But keep in mind that a lot of this is going to end up getting trimmed off. So if you only have a slightly shorter piece of fabric, make sure that you watch how this goes in this video, because that'll let you know if you can get away with using a shorter piece of fabric and it'll still work out right. Now, the other thing that I've made myself here is just a couple of hardwood dowels. These just happen to be birch dowels, but don't feel like you have to go out and buy dowels for this. You can use any good, clear, strong hardwood that you have around the shop. And you can just cut these to 5/8 of an inch by 5/8 of an inch square on your table saw, and then you can round them off yourself and make sure that you round over the edges here so they're not sharp. Now, these should be 4 inches longer than whatever distance this is right here. Now, the way that all this is going to come together here is we're going to take the cloth like this, and I'm going to fold this around right here. You can't see what I'm doing on this side, but you'll be able to see it on the other side. Okay, I just got one side done. Now coming over to this side, you can see this. I put my dowel behind the fabric, I fold the fabric over it like this, and then I tuck this dowel down behind the rib here and push it back until I can get the other end of it behind the rib over here, and then I can push it forward. And when you're done, you should see just a little bit of that dowel sticking out on either side of the rib here. And then from there, you just want to grab the fabric underneath here and start tightening it up. Now, keep in mind, unless you're very lucky, you're never going to get this perfect on the first try. But what you're roughly looking to do here is just put this in place so it's just draping down and just barely touching the keel right there. And then once you've done that, you want to make sure that this folded piece underneath here is coming out nice and straight, and you can go ahead and mark both layers at once wherever you want to stitch this fabric up. And I would recommend stitching the fabric up about 1 inch inwards from the inside edge of the dowel here. So I'm going to mark top layer and bottom layer at the same time, and then reaching back here, not letting it move. I'm going to do the same thing back here. I'm going to come over to the opposite side here. And once again, this is just draping loosely from both sides of the kayak down to where it's touching the keel in the middle. And I'm going to squeeze it together, squeeze the top and the bottom layer, and mark them just like that, about 1 inch in from the edge of the dowel. I'm going to do the same thing at the back here. And then something you're going to want to do is make some type of an identifying mark to tell you which edge is forward, because these aren't sewn perfectly parallel. They're actually slightly tapered inwards. So you want to make sure that you know which end goes forward when it goes back in the kayak. So now that we've got this marked out here, just go ahead and pull this out. And I'm going to fold this in half so these alignment marks that we made are just touching each other again. I'm going to grab a straight pin and I'm going to pin the 2 layers of fabric together. I'll flip it around to the other side here and I'll line up these alignment marks as well. I'm going to take another straight pin and I'm going to pin this fabric together as well. And then the next thing that we're going to do here is take this to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a single straight stitch right between these 2 sets of alignment marks. So once you've got the fabric pinned together here, next thing you can do is get a straight edge and a pencil, and you can just go ahead and connect those 2 alignment marks. And then you're going to end up stitching right along this line. Now, the way that I like to do this is I just take the same thread that I used to stitch up the kayak and I load it into my sewing machine, and I do a single line of stitching along here. But if you don't have a sewing machine, you can just go ahead and stitch this by hand. It really doesn't take very long, but it's very important that you don't do any more than 1 line of stitching, because you're almost always going to have to cut out at least one side of this and redo it to fine tune the feeling and the height of your seat. All right, so bringing this back over to the kayak here, we can just take our dowels, we can slide them into those pockets that we just made on either side here. And then we can tuck those behind the ribs. Sometimes it's a little tricky to get it behind the ribs. Okay, same thing on the other side here. And then hopefully, if everything went well, what you have here is a seat that will allow your sit bones to sink nice and low in the kayak, so you're going to be as stable as possible, but it'll prevent you from sinking any lower than that and getting uncomfortable by feeling the ribs or the keel. Now, keep in mind, you're never going to get this right on the first try. What you want to do is just set it up, take it out, go for a paddle, and then if it feels like you're still feeling the ribs or the keel, you can take it out and rip out one of these seams and sew it up a little bit tighter. And you'll probably want to do that at least a couple times, because the fabric is always going to stretch a little bit over time. But when you finally feel like you've got it perfect, what you can do is double stitch along these seams and then cut off any excess fabric on the back side. Now, something really important to point out here is that you don't want this to be too tight, because if this is fully suspended up here, when you sit on it, it's going to put way too much stress on the dowels and on the ribs and on the frame here. All this is just a little bit of extra support at the bottom, so when you're sitting down on it, you don't end up sinking so low that you start to feel the ribs. So definitely don't tighten this up so it's sitting up here nice and tight. So one last thing to mention here is that even if you have one of these in place, it's good to have a foam mat over the top of them just to protect the ribs, and also it'll just make the whole arrangement even more comfortable.